Welcome back. Welcome back to Marketing 3401. Right now, we're going to talk about Chapter 6. In Chapter 5, we talked about individual buyer behavior, individual consumers. And so for Chapter 6, we're going to focus more on business markets and business buying behavior. Again, the key point here is that we're talking about businesses who are buying raw materials, as an example, so that they can make a product, and raw materials are an industrial ingredient. And so it can be, let's say, RAM or motherboards or video cards that Dell or HP might purchase in order to create computers that we buy as end consumers or end users. So we're going to talk about business markets, the behavior process that goes on with buyers and their marketplaces. And then lastly, we'll talk about the e-procurement process, essentially how some of this business-to-business buying and selling goes on online. It's a huge and really growing market. And then talk a little bit about how some institutions like hospitals and governments have a different kind of buying process than you would find at IBM or Hewlett-Packard or Sears or some of the other major industrial companies. So formulated definition here in terms of business buyers, it refers to buyers of organizations that buy goods and services for use in production of other products. Essentially, we're talking about inputs, raw materials, and the like. And so the process that they have, very different from consumers. It's a little bit more involved because we're talking about products that in many ways have to conform to certain specifications because they are regarded as an input or raw material or component part to making an overall product. There are fewer buyers, but they're huge, large buyers. I mean, the amount of dollars that we're talking about that are transacted between business to business really dwarf the business consumer marketplace. And all of the demand for these component parts, these raw materials, they're all what we call derived demand. Essentially, what derived demand means is that the demand for motherboards and video cards at HP is dependent upon the demand for computers, the underlying demand for computers from people like you and me, individual consumers, or final users. It could be an institution as well. And generally, when we think about that demand, it's usually inelastic. As you remember from basic econ, inelastic means insensitive. So as the price goes up, it doesn't really necessarily have an effect on demand. So they're not going to be as price sensitive as consumers may be, mainly because they really need to continue to buy motherboards if they really want to continue to satisfy the demand for the underlying computers at Dell or HP. And the demand, though, does fluctuate. It fluctuates based on our demand for products. So, for example, if you're a toy manufacturer and plastic is a key ingredient that you use to make molds for dolls, the demand for that plastic will spike up typically sometime around the summertime, ramping up for production for companies to actually make purchases of toys to sell to consumers during the Christmas season. These business markets tend to be a little bit more complex, mainly because they are a component part that has to fit in with other component parts that eventually get put together that creates a product that you or I might ultimately buy. There are many, many more people who have a hand, and we'll talk about the buying center, but many more people who have a hand in the decision in terms of not only what supplier you use, but the level of quality that you might expect for a particular piece of raw material. And it's more professional because we're talking about individuals representing their companies, transacting business, but still there is a personal component, and we'll talk about that as well. Also, too, the buyers and the sellers are more dependent. Oftentimes, many manufacturers don't want to have all of their for example, if you're a car manufacturer, you want to have multiple suppliers of rubber. So when you have to put tires onto your cars, you want to make sure you have multiple suppliers of rubber because you don't want to get caught up in some sort of snafu within their supply chain. They could be faced with a shortage of rubber as a company, and therefore they're not able to manufacture tires in the kind of quantity that you might need, or the quality that you might need, or the size that you might need. Also, too, they might have some labor strife. Let's say they have a strike at Firestone. That might have a profound effect on how many cars Chrysler can produce that are ready to go out the showroom to potential buyers. So generally, when we think about suppliers as a general group, I mean, typically, many customer companies are now practicing what they call supplier development. In other words, we're talking about systematically developing networks of supplier partners so that they can make sure that they have a dependable supply of products and materials that they use in making their own. So in other words, you want to make sure that there are enough qualified manufacturers of your component parts out there who can compete, keeping prices down for the underlying product. And that just makes it more of a healthy environment, a more certain environment for a manufacturer. Now, oftentimes we do have vertical integration too, where a manufacturer, let's say, for example, of cars, will decide that they want to actually purchase the rubber company. Or if you are a bottler or a manufacturer of soda and you want to make sure you have an adequate supply of aluminum cans, you may go out and purchase an aluminum factory, so you'll make sure that you have an adequate supply. But even then, you have to have a balance between what you currently own and the availability of another source of that particular supply. Now, this may look very similar in structure to the original one that we talked about with regard to consumers. So generally, again, at the very end in the red box here, we're talking about buyers and how they behave. And here we're talking about purchasing or choosing not to purchase. And all the factors that have an influence on what we actually purchase or don't purchase. And we're going to talk about these one at a time in a few minutes. But before we get to this, we're going to talk about the environmental, organizational, interpersonal, and individual components. Before we do this, we want to talk a few minutes about the different types of buying situations. Generally speaking, we have three categories: straight rebuy, modified rebuy, and new task rebuy. I'll give you a quick example. Let's say, for example, you are in the business of, let's say you're a CPA firm, and you decide that you need to have a copy machine in order to be able to make copies of the tax returns that you provide to your clients. So when you start your business, a new task might be for you to make a decision about the type of copy machines you want to purchase. So it's going to be a little bit more involved. It requires a lot of thorough research because you haven't done it before. And so you may look at a host of different brands. You may have a bunch of criteria that you use in terms of quality and speed and maybe some other things. That would be an example of a new task. A modified rebuy would be if a particular a copy machine either breaks down or the lease is up and you want to get a new one. So after 5 years, you get rid of the old one. So the next time you buy that copy machine, it's going to be a modified rebuy. You've already experienced it. You know the criteria that works. You know the pricing. You know the vendors. You know their quality. You know their service components and how good they are in responding to breakdowns and having people come and service it. You kind of know it. So you already know things about the supplier and the supplier industry in that particular case. And so it's a modified rebuy. A straight rebuy typically would be one where we're talking about making a purchase that's more routine. Now, in the case that we were talking about with the copy machines, buying the paper on a monthly or quarterly basis would probably be a good example of a straight rebuy. You know how many reams you need, you know the quality of the paper that you usually order, and that's something that's really simple. Probably not a whole lot of sign-off in terms of different individuals. So looking at it from the bottom up, these new tasks typically require a lot more approval, a lot more people getting involved, because it's a little bit more complicated. When it's a modified rebuy, maybe not as many people getting involved, but because of the cost oftentimes, depending on what it is, if we're talking about copy machines, it might be pretty significant if we're talking about a dozen of them as an example. So you may have less people involved, but it still takes a critical eye to look at it. With regard to a straight rebuy, if we're talking about purchasing the actual paper itself, typically it's going to be purchasing in terms of the purchasing department. Best price for a given level of quality. Pretty much that's it at the end of the day. That's all they want to know about. Now, another major type of buying situation is what we call system selling. IBM probably is one of the larger companies that kind of pioneered this. Another way that people talk about it is they call it solution selling. And so actually IBM converted their business model from a long time ago being one that sold physical hardware goods. So they sold lots of computers. Mainframe computers, they sold a lot of personal computers to business, and also some business computers or consumer computers to people like us. But one of the things that they realized in the early 1990s is that this was the wrong way to build your business as far as they were concerned. And so what they got into the business of doing is selling solutions to their clients, solutions that would help solve a particular problem. It could be a logistics problem. It could be one of manufacturing. And so what they did was they pretty much sold consulting services. And oh, by the way, the only way that you could implement the solution would be to use IBM hardware and software to get the job done. So the general group that we talk about where there is some decision that needs to be made, we call that the buying center. It's all the people, individuals, or their units that participate in this business decision-making process. And we're going to talk about here a few examples of some titles and descriptions of people who are involved in this. Users, those who will use the product or service. So going back to the copy machine example, somebody who runs the copy room, that's going to be the person who will actually use the copy machine. An influencer might be somebody who might be, let's say, at a supervisory position where they might buy or be responsible for selecting copy machines for, let's say, the entire university. And each department within the university will have users who will actually use it on a day-to-day basis. Buyers typically are these procurement departments. All they do is they look at the specification and they try to find the best price possible. So they're more looking at what kind of value can we get? Are we getting a good quality product with good benefits, satisfying our particular needs? And then what's the cost? And that's really the important thing. And a decider may very well, depending on how you're structured as an organization, it may very well be the CEO if we're talking about a small company. A large enterprise like a university is probably going to be someone who has signing authorization to make purchases. So it could be vice president of procurement. It could be the managing director of a particular department. Now the last one, not to be understated, are these gatekeepers. And these are people who have control and flow of information. These could be receptionists, they could be secretaries, administrative assistants, anybody who can stay in the way between you and a decision maker potentially. You see this a lot in pharmaceutical sales where pharmaceutical reps from Pfizer or wherever will go into doctors' offices all around the country. And oftentimes if they can't get past those front desk people, they will never ever speak to the doctors who are going to be in the decision making position, but they're also the users in that they write the scripts and they decide what medications their patients are going to be given. So the buying center, it's a challenge for someone trying to sell to them because you don't really know oftentimes who has the power, who has the relative authority, who should you be talking to first, who should you be talking to second, which person should be in the position where you provide some of your marketing techniques to, who should you give away free samples to. If it's allowed in your industry, who is the person you should give free tickets to your conference to? I mean, who are these people who are in the position to essentially give you an order? So in a new situation, it's really difficult to know who these people are until you actually do your research. And so you also have to know what kind of criteria, if they all have equal input, what are they looking for? Excuse me, is it just the price? That might be true for a procurement person. Is it specification or meeting specifications? That might be some engineer who says they want the best motherboard to put into the computer that he or she is building. So it really depends, but it's really got to be something that you have to figure out the answer to. And then you might also have, like I said, these gatekeepers, the informal participants, people who you just don't really know have say. or control over information. So the important point is to assess and then come up with an action plan that will kind of get you to where you need to be. Now, not to be understated, obviously price and the service that you're going to get for the products that you're purchasing. Let's say if you're Xerox and you're trying to sell your copy machines, price will be important, your servicing will be very important, but also too, you have to think about the interpersonal relationships. I mean, sometimes it really comes down to whether or not that buyer likes that salesperson. It's that simple. All things being equal in terms of price with other competitors and service with other competitors, maybe it might boil down to the fact that the two parties golf together. Sometimes it can be just as simple as that. Some of the other influences in terms of the macroeconomic stuff that I think we keep seeing, it keeps coming up and recurring. Obviously, economic trends and outlooks will have an impact on people's willingness and ability to spend. What does it cost them to potentially borrow the money in order to make the purchase of your product or service? How about the technology? How well does it integrate into the technology that they currently have? Going back to the Dell and HP example, there has to be a technical specification fit when we're talking about component parts to put together a computer that people like us will see as having some kind of value. You have to think about the competitive landscape. You have to know your competitors. Who else are they talking to satisfy that need? You have to understand that. Also, too, you have to know to what extent is the supply of the material that they're using to make their product available. Are you the leading supplier of that product, that component part? Are you considered to be the top brand name in that particular category? So you have to understand all sorts of external factors. Is there a high demand for that product? The more people manufacturing computers, the more there is a demand for Intel's chips. And so once there is demand for that chip, that might have an impact on the cost or the availability of those chips. So you have to look at all these factors to make sure that you understand how they might have an impact on a decision your potential customers might make. Now also too, we think about some of the influences here within an organization, so organizational factors. Some of the questions that you might ask are, how many people are involved in the decision-making process? Who are they? What are the evaluative criteria that each person has to determine whether or not they want to buy from your organization? And what are the company's policies and limits on buying? Some companies, for example, say that they don't want to have a concentration of more than 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, whatever it is, with one supplier. You have to know what those limitations are, and that will help you in terms of putting together your sales pitch to that organization. And you'll have an idea also too in terms of the type of volume you can expect. You know, notwithstanding, I think I mentioned this earlier, but anytime you're dealing with somebody on a business-to-business kind of transaction, it's still relationships. It's all about relationships. And so you have to understand who is sitting across from you, who you might be negotiating with. This particular person might be a very risk-averse person. So for him or her, they might go down the path of least risk. So they might go with a known brand or known quantity, or if you've come out with a new model of a chip, they may err on the side of using the old model until you've proven that the new model you have satisfies the needs better or just as well, and is reliable. What's their education level? Are they an astute buyer? Sometimes you may have to take the back seat because that person may know more about your product than you do. Age and preferences and all these things that we think about with individuals, the important point is keep in mind that they are individual people, and you have to understand how their individuality might have an impact on you connecting with them and having them motivated to buy your solution or your product or service over some of your competitors. Now this looks similar in the sense that we have another model here, a process here. We still, like everything else, we have some kind of problem recognition. And when we think of having a problem that we recognize, and I'm going to skip forward here to the slides for each individual one. But when we talk about recognizing a problem, oftentimes it may be you have a new product that you have coming out, and you need raw materials to manufacture that product. Now, for that new product launch, you may have zero room for error. You want zero defects. So you typically may go with a brand that you know, a raw material that you know, and a supplier that you know. So it really depends. But also, too, you have other external factors that might have an impact on it. What are your competitors using, as an example? What's the information that's out there that might in some way persuade you that the new version of the product that you're using or will buy is the best way to go? So there are lots of factors that go into play, but the problem recognition generally is, do we have a demand? And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of it is about derived demand. So if you see a step up in demand for your underlying product, then that kind of says to you, well, we have a problem because we don't have enough product in terms of motherboards or video cards, because we have so much demand for our computers. We're going to need some more of those in order to satisfy that derived demand. And the next stage is what we would call the general need description. It describes the characteristics and the quantity of the items needed. Again, it kind of falls into this whole product specification thing. You're buying component parts and you want to put them all together. And you have to make sure within a certain level of tolerance that these component parts, like a puzzle, fit together. And so if there's some uncertainty as to whether or not a particular part will fit in with existing component parts, people tend to shy away. But that's where you have a great salesperson will come in, because that person will be very knowledgeable about his client's business, and she will also know how her new component fits into the existing manufacturing structure of the product that they're making for end users. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to, does this fit into what we're currently creating and at what cost? So sometimes having an existing product that you can kind of say, as they say, taken off the shelf and integrated, that's a lot better than trying to have to come up with a customized solution. Because customized solutions are great, but they come at a great cost, which you may not be able to get away with passing on to your end user consumer. Then you have to figure out, once you figure out what you want to buy and in what quantity and what quality specifications, you got to figure out who's the universe of suppliers. And oftentimes this is a relatively simple question to answer, because in most industries it's a very close-knit group. So people meet each other at trade shows and the like. So they kind of know who is actually out there. And so you ask each of them to put together a proposal, and the proposal comes together with not only price but quantity and also to something related to servicing. And so you're able to assess, again, how does this satisfy your ultimate needs? And again, also thinking about the interpersonal component, that has to be taken into consideration as well. So you select your supplier, and at the very least, you want to make sure you have a backup supplier. Because the one thing that happens sometimes in terms of suppliers, they talk a good game in terms of being able to provide X amount of quantity, but when you give them the order, sometimes maybe their manufacturing facilities really aren't made to increase or spike the demand that might be necessary for you to get the supply that you need. So having a backup might be also a good idea as well. So order something, give them a smaller order. That's usually the thing to do if you are a producer, a buyer. Give them a smaller order. See how they do. See how good the quality is when they produce 10,000 units, as an example. If you see too many defects in that 10,000 units, you don't want to give them then the order for 100,000 units unless you know they've done something to change the production process and quality control. So then again, quality control, you have some evaluation, performance evaluation, where you can critique them. Again, it's about performance, it's about the service, it's about reliability, all the things that go into any kind of client and supplier relationship. And you should do an assessment. Most people recommend that you at least assess every 6 months. so twice a year, and sometimes even more so, depending on how critical that component part is and how rapidly the supply changes. And so you want to make sure you're on top of it. So keep an eye on your competitors. You want to make sure that they are a viable entity. So if they are struggling, and you should have backups, and 2 backups actually. So if they are struggling financially, you want to make sure that you have an alternative to supply you with your raw materials. Now, I want to spend a few minutes talking about online procurement, which is basically online purchasing. It's becoming more and more common, especially for those products or component parts that are essentially raw materials or commodities, in a sense where there's no difference in the specification. They pretty much hit the mark in terms of its specifications and the quality. And so essentially these intranets, these relationships that we carry on online in terms of buying and selling, are really there to essentially save on cost. So, you know, some of the advantages of it, you may have access to suppliers you've never heard of. So a lot of these are online bidding marketplaces. It can eventually lead to lower costs. Again, introducing more competition is always good for buyers when it comes to cost. The ordering process, usually it's a lot quicker because it's your systems are interacting with their systems. So oftentimes when you actually make your initial purchase, any repeat purchases will be generated as a result of hitting some sort of a supply deficiency, in the sense that you get down to a critical level of supply parts, and then it triggers an automatic order. So that can be very helpful. And also too, you can share information. Many times some of the enhancements or changes to component parts may come out as a result of research and development that's being done by the manufacturers of the end products. And hopefully, you know, sales and service and support, many of those things can actually be conducted online, which makes it a little bit more efficient. The disadvantage is that, again, like I said before, it's about relationships. And so, you know, when you have relationships, sometimes that can help and cement trust within a dyad of supplier and buyer. But when it's all done online, it becomes very mechanical. Now, lastly, these institutional markets, they consist mainly of hospitals, universities and colleges, nursing homes, prisons, anybody who is buying products and services. It could be food, it could be linens, anything that people will use to provide the service to their end users and end customers. So you can imagine in a prison, they buy in bulk lots of food and lots of material to have the inmates wear. So if someone is supplying uniforms to the guards, as an example, there's an implied demand for that based on the number of guards that you have, potential growth, and things of that nature. The government market also too is a very lucrative market. Some people say too lucrative. Most governments, state and as well as local and federal, they typically will have some requirement where they need to get a certain number of proposals to make sure that on a competitive bid basis, to make sure they're getting the lowest price. Now, one of the problems that we're seeing right now is that the many governments, especially the federal government, have had drastic cuts in some of their purchasing. So if you are a supplier, it's your job to really understand what some of those changes are. Are there any changes to the bidding process? Are there any changes to the criteria that they use to get you on the preferred supplier list? And that might be, you know, depending on what we're talking about in terms of state, local, federal government, it might be that you might have to have a certain amount of capital on hand. Again, making sure that you're a viable entity. You may have to have some objectively verifiable quality measurements in terms of what you produce. So it can be very complicated, but again, it may be worth it because the dollars that governments are spending, even when they're cutting back, may be very significant. Okay, so that ends chapter 6. So I will see you next time around on chapter 7.